The trunk stood at the foot of the bed, its brass clasps catching the thin gray light of the morning. It was not a large trunk. It was the plain kind a governess might own, banded in worn leather, the sort of thing that drew no eye in a house where every other object was gilded or carved or old beyond price. Yet it stood open, and it was half full. Delphine folded a linen shift with the same unhurried care she gave to every task, laid it atop the others, and smoothed the fabric flat with the edge of her hand. She did not hurry. She never hurried. Haste, she had learned long ago, was the language of people who believed the world owed them their wishes, and she had stopped believing that a great while ago. On the writing desk by the window lay a single sheet of paper, unfinished, the ink gone dry on the nib beside it. 3 words only, "My dear Rowan." She had written that much and no more, because she did not yet know how a woman was meant to end a letter that ended a marriage. She had heard the news at dawn, before the maids had drawn the curtains, before the fires were lit. A rider had come up the north road in the dark with a lathered horse and a message sealed in green wax, and the whole household had known its contents within the hour, the way a house always knows the things it is not meant to know. The Lady Serica had returned from the continent. She was already at the coaching inn in the valley. By nightfall, she would be at the gates of Harrowmere. Serica. The name. The servant said softly, the way one says the name of a person believed dead. The name that hung in the portrait gallery beneath a length of black cloth that no one had ever quite dared to remove. The woman the Duke had loved before he had ever heard of Delphine. The woman he had meant to marry in the years before the war. Took her east, and grief took the rest. Delphine folded another shift. She was not a fool, and she was not a coward, and she had never once, in 3 years, mistaken duty for love. She knew precisely what she was to this house, a settlement, a signature, a quiet remedy for an old wound. And she knew what a returning ghost would ask of a man who had spent 5 years mourning it. He would have to choose, and she had decided, in the gray light, that he would not have to choose in front of her, so she packed, quietly, before he could. To understand why the house held its breath that morning, one must understand the 2 people at the center of it and how little they resembled what the world believed them to be. Rowan Aldermere, 7th Duke of Harrowmere, was a man built entirely of restraint. He was tall and spare, with a face that seemed cut from stone rather than born of flesh, and pale eyes that gave away nothing at all. The county called him cold. The tenants called him fair but distant. His own footman had served him 4 years and could not have said whether he preferred his tea sweet. He rose before the sun, rode the estate in all weathers, answered every letter the same day it arrived, and spoke, when he spoke, in sentences trimmed of every unnecessary word. Grief had done this to him, though few remembered him as anything else. When Serica's ship had been reported lost off the Barbary coast, he had not wept, not that anyone saw. He had simply closed a door somewhere inside himself and gone on living behind it. Delphine, his Duchess, was his opposite in every visible way and his mirror in every hidden one. Where he was cold, she was merely quiet, a stillness that people mistook for meekness until they had known her long enough to feel the steel beneath it. She had come to Harrowmere 3 years ago from a family with an ancient name and no money left to hang upon it, and she had taken up the role of Duchess the way a soldier takes up a post, with discipline, with grace, and with no expectation of being loved for it. She ran the great house flawlessly. She was gentle with the maids and just with the stewards, and unfailingly serene with the guests who came to inspect her and found to their faint disappointment nothing to gossip about. And she loved her husband. That was the thing no one knew, because she had taken great care that no one should. She had not meant to. It had crept upon her over 3 years of shared silences, of small courtesies, neither of them named. The book left open to a page he thought she would like, the way he always waited at the top of the stair, though he never offered his arm. She had learned to love a man who had never once told her he loved her, and she had made her peace with the arithmetic of that, so long as the accounts were never called in. Now the ghost had come home to call them in. And the terrible thing, the thing that turned Delphine's blood to still water, was this. She could not even hate the woman, for if Serica was alive, then Rowan's 5 years of grief had been true grief, and true grief is the shape love leaves behind. She was not being betrayed, she was simply being remembered second. The marriage itself had been a thing of paper and lawyers, arranged in the space of a single autumn by men who never troubled to ask either party what they wished. Delphine's remaining guardian had wanted her off his hands. The Duke had wanted an end to the county's endless speculation about the grieving bachelor of Harrowmere, and a mistress for a house that had none. They had met 3 times before the wedding, always with others present, and had exchanged perhaps 100 words. She had thought him carved from ice. He had, she later learned, thought almost nothing of her at all. A suitable, silent, well-bred girl who would run his house and ask nothing of his heart, which suited him perfectly, since his heart, so far as he knew, had gone down with a ship off the Barbary coast. Neither of them had expected to be changed by it. That was the quiet joke of the whole thing, the joke Delphine had never dared laugh at aloud, that 2 people who had married precisely in order to feel nothing had spent 3 years failing, gently and separately and in total silence, to go on feeling nothing at all. That was the problem. Not that he might choose wrongly, but that by every honest measure he might choose rightly, and it would not be her. Harrowmere had not always been a silent house, and Delphine had spent 3 years quietly teaching it to breathe again. She remembered the state of it when she first arrived. The shrouded mirrors, the clock stopped at no particular hour, the long dining table laid every night for a man who ate alone at one end of it and left before the covers were cleared. The staff had moved through the rooms like people afraid of waking something. She had changed all of it without once raising her voice. She had the mirrors uncovered one at a time, so gradually that no one marked the day the last cloth came down. She had the clocks wound. She had a second place laid at the table at the near end, close to his, and had sat there the first evening in perfect stillness while he stared at the setting as though it were an accusation. He had said nothing, but he had not had it removed. And the next night it was laid again, and he had sat, and slowly, over months, the length of that great table had shrunk from a gulf to a distance to at last an arm's reach. That was how they had built the thing between them, not with declarations, but with small mercies, neither acknowledged. There was the matter of the winter mornings when he rode out before light to the tenant farms on the high moor and came back half frozen, and she had taken to seeing that hot-spiced wine was waiting when he returned, never handed to him, only there on the hall table, steaming. He had never thanked her for it, but one bitter morning he had come back and found the hall table bare, because a new footman had not been told, and he had stood in the doorway a moment too long, and something had crossed his still face that she had understood better than any speech. There was the summer she had learned by accident that he could not abide cut flowers in the house, because Serica had loved them, and every vase was a small grave, and so she had quietly filled the rooms instead with growing things in pots, herbs, and a lemon tree brought at great trouble from the south, living green that asked nothing of the dead. He had walked into the morning room, seen the change, and said only, after a long moment, "That is better," 2 words. She had carried them a week. There was the matter of his reading. She had discovered that beneath the ledgers and the estate correspondence he kept, half ashamed, a shelf of old poetry he never admitted to, and she had begun leaving her own book open on the arm of his chair when she rose for the night. Never the same poet, never a word said, and had found morning after morning the ribbon moved to a new page. It was the nearest thing to conversation they had for the better part of a year, 2 people speaking to each other in the margins of borrowed books, each pretending not to notice the other, had answered. There was, too, the matter of his sleep, or the lack of it. She had learned in her first winter, that the Duke did not sleep as other men slept, that he would sit in the library long past the dying of the fire, not working, only staring at the black windows as though he could see through them to some other country. She had never disturbed him, but she had begun, on the worst nights, when the wind came off the moor like something grieving, to leave a single lamp burning low in the passage between the library and the stair, so that when at last he climbed to his cold rooms, he would not have to do it in the dark. He had never mentioned the lamp, but it had never once gone unlit after that first night, and she had come to understand that a servant would have snuffed it to save the oil, and that he knew, therefore, exactly whose hand kept it burning. These were the only love letters they had ever exchanged. A lamp, a book, a cup of wine gone cold on a hall table. Delphine had told herself for a long time that they were nothing, the ordinary courtesies of a well-run house, and she had gone on telling herself so, right up until the morning the green waxed letter came and she discovered, folding shifts into a trunk with steady hands, that the thought of never again lighting that passage lamp was the thing she could least bear to think about at all. And there was the library, which had become, without either of them deciding it, the country of their evenings. He at the wide desk with the estate ledgers, she in the deep chair by the fire, with whatever book she was reading, the great old wolf-gray hunting dog Bramble asleep across both their feet like a bridge. They did not always speak. Often an entire evening passed with nothing said but the turn of a page and the shift of a log. And yet she had come to feel that those silences were the truest conversation she had ever had with a living soul, that in the quiet, with the dog breathing between them and the rain on the tall windows, they were for an hour simply two people who had chosen to sit in the same room and were glad of it. Once, only once, he had fallen asleep in his chair over the ledgers, and she had risen to bank the fire, and had stood a moment looking at his unguarded face, the grief lines slack, and she had almost, laid her hand against his cheek. She had not. She had put a blanket over him and gone up to bed, and in the morning neither of them had spoken of the blanket, though it was folded on the arm of his chair, and he had not asked which servant had thought to bring it. This was the marriage, not passion, not the kind of love the ballads sang. Something quieter, and she had believed more durable for it. A house slowly warming, a table slowly closing, two careful people learning the shape of each other in the dark. She had read once in one of the volumes she left open on his chair that the deepest rivers run with the least sound, and she had thought at the time that it was the sort of thing poets say to make quietness sound like more than it is. She no longer thought so. She had learned in this house that the loudest griefs are often the shallowest, spent in a season, while the true and lasting things move under the surface of a life making almost no sound at all. A lamp lit in a passage, a place laid at a table. A woman folding shifts into a trunk with steady hands because she loves a man too well to make him choose her to her face. And now, in a single morning, a rider on the North Road had made her understand exactly how much she had allowed herself to hope, by the exact measure of how much it now cost to fold it into a plain leather trunk. Bramble had followed her up to the bedchamber and lay now across the doorway, his great head on his paws, watching her pack with dark, sorrowful, uncomprehending eyes, the one member of the household who plainly could not understand why his mistress was folding her life into a box, and who would not, whatever happened, be told the reason. She reached the desk, sat, and picked up the dry pen. She would have to find the words. "My dear Rowan." Below the house, faint through the floors, a door opened, and a footstep she knew better than her own crossed the hall toward the stair. She had a secret of her own, and it had nothing to do with grief. Delphine set the pen down again. The truth was that she had not come to Harrowmere 3 years ago as merely a poor girl with a good name, sold off to settle a debt. That was the story the county believed, and she had let them believe it, because the real story was one she could tell no one. least of all the man asleep in the library on those long winter nights. Her father had not simply died penniless. He had died accused. Lord Casimir Vane, once one of the great naturalists of the age, a man who had corresponded with academies across 3 countries, had died in disgrace under a charge of fraud, of having falsified the survey of a mineral seam that ruined a dozen investors when it proved worthless. He had sworn to the last that the survey he submitted was not the survey that reached the court, that a page had been swapped, that an honest map had been turned into a lie by a hand not his own. No one had listened. The name Vane had become a byword for ruin, and his daughter had gone from a scholar's bright child to an embarrassment to be married off quietly to whoever would take her without asking questions. But Delphine had listened. She had been 16, and she had believed him, and she had never once stopped. She remembered the house they had lived in before the ruin, not grand, but warm, cluttered with her father's specimens, and his correspondence and the great brass instruments he used to measure the bones of the earth. She remembered him at his work table by lamplight, tracing a coal seam onto vellum, with a care that was very nearly reverence, telling her that a survey was a kind of promise, that a man put his name to what the ground truly held, and that to lie about it was to lie to every soul who would ever dig there trusting your word. He had said this to her more than once, and she had not understood, at 8 years old, that he was teaching her the shape of the thing that would one day destroy him. She remembered the trial only in fragments, for she had been kept from most of it. The crowded room, the murmuring, her father's straight back, and his voice going hoarse as he said, again and again, that the 3rd page was not his, that the figures were not his figures, that someone had put a lie beneath his true and honest name. She remembered how no one had met his eyes. And she remembered most of all the silence in the house afterward, the creditors and the shame and the slow selling off of everything, the brass instruments going one by one until there was nothing left of the great naturalist Casimir Vane, but a byword and a girl with his stubborn belief sewn into her like a second spine. And here was the thing she had carried into this house like a stone sewn into a hem. The investors her father had supposedly ruined had been assembled by an agent acting for the old Duke of Harrowmere, Rowan's late father. The survey her father certified had passed through this estate's hands before it was bound into the copy that reached the courts. Somewhere in Harrowmere, in the muniment room where the old Duke had hoarded every deed and letter and ledger of 40 years, Delphine believed the honest original still lay, the true survey in her father's own hand, whole and unaltered, the one that would prove he had told the truth and someone here had made him a liar. She had not married Rowan for love. She had married him for a key. Learning to be what this house expected had been its own long labor. A duchess is watched, in ways a maid is not. There is no corner of a great house where the mistress is truly unobserved, and Delphine had had to school every glance and footstep to seem to drift where she in fact went with purpose, to appear to care nothing for the north wing while mapping every door and key of it in her mind. She had turned her whole self into an instrument as fine and patient as any her father had ever bent over his surveys, and the terrible irony which she felt most on the night she could not sleep was that the disguise had asked of her exactly the qualities her father had prized: patience, precision, an unwavering hold on a truth no one else could see, so that in becoming a spy in her enemy's house, she had become more than ever her father's daughter. That was the shame that sat beneath every gentle thing she did in this house. She had come as a spy in her own wedding gown. She had smiled at the man across the shrinking table while planning, always planning, how to reach the one locked room he never opened and never spoke of. For 3 years she had waited for her chance, and for 3 years something had stopped her, and only in the gray light of this morning had she let herself name what it was. She had stopped because somewhere along the way she had begun to hope she might not need proof to be forgiven. She has. That a man might come to value her, for herself, and that when she finally confessed why she had come, he would believe her the way no one had believed her father. Now Serica was on the North Road, and the hope was folding into a trunk, and the only thing left of her purpose was the cold original of it. If she was to leave this house, she would not leave it empty-handed. Before the ghost reached the gates, Delphine meant to open the one door that had been shut against her for 3 years. The footstep on the stair stopped at her door. She did not turn. She heard the latch, heard the door swing, heard the particular quality of his silence, which she had learned to read the way sailors read weather. Ta! Bramble lifted his head and thumped his tail once against the boards, then uncertain lowered it again. "You have heard," Rowan said. "The whole house has heard, Your Grace." She folded the last shift and did not look at the trunk, which said everything she would not. He came a step into the room. She could see him now in the glass, tall, still, his riding coat spotted with the morning's damp, his eyes moving from the open trunk to the half-written letter to her composed and downturned face, reading the room the way he read a ledger, adding the columns. "What is this?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I am putting some things in order." Her voice was perfectly level. "There will be a great deal of coming and going in the next days. I did not wish to be underfoot." "You are the Duchess of Harrowmere," he said. "You cannot be underfoot in your own house." "My own house." She let the small mercy of the word pass without reaching for it. "Even so," she said. He was quiet a moment. Then, with the terrible directness that was the only weapon he had never learned to sheathe, "You are leaving." Here it was. She might have denied it. She might have wept, or clung, or asked him the question that beat under her ribs. "Do you love me? Have you ever? Could you?" Any woman with less pride and more sense would have done exactly that, and perhaps it would even have worked, for she saw something flicker behind his eyes that was not indifference. But she thought of Serica in the Valley Inn, 5 years grieved and now impossibly alive, and she thought that if she made him choose, while she stood before him with her heart in her open hands, then whatever he chose would be an act of pity or of guilt, and she would spend the rest of her life not knowing which. She would rather lose him clean than keep him owed. So she said only, "I think, Your Grace, that this house is about to have a great deal to settle, and that it will settle it more honestly without me standing in the corner of every room. I ask nothing of you. I have never asked anything of you." She turned then, met his eyes directly, which she almost never did. "You should go down and prepare. She will be cold from the road." It was the cruelest kind thing she had ever said, and she watched it land. He was a man who had built his whole self around not being read, and she had just read him aloud, had named, without a tremor, that his first thought upon a returning ghost would be that Serica would be cold from the road, and that Delphine had already stepped out of the way of it. For one moment the stone of his face was not stone. Something moved across it, protest perhaps, or the beginning of a word. His hand rose an inch from his side. Then the discipline of 5 years closed over him like water over a stone. He inclined his head, that small formal bow he gave to tenants and bishops, and said, "As you think best," and went out, and the latch clicked, and his footstep went back down the stair. Slower, she thought, than it had come up, though she may only have wished it. Bramble rose, crossed the room, and pressed his great gray head against her knee, and she stood very still and did not let herself sit down, because she knew that if she sat down, she would not get up in time to do what she had left to do. The days that followed taught Delphine exactly how a house rearranges itself around a homecoming. There is a particular dread in waiting for a thing you have chosen not to fight. Delphine had made her decision in the gray of that first morning, and having made it, she found the waiting almost unbearable. Not because she doubted it, but because every hour until Serica came was an hour she still had, a last unlooked-for measure of the life she was giving up. She caught herself hoarding small things, the sound of Rowan's boots in the hall, the particular gray of the moor at dusk from the library window, the weight of Bramble's head on her foot. She was saying goodbye to a house, one detail at a time, and no one but the dog had the least idea she was doing it. Serica did not arrive that night. A second rider brought word that the lady was fatigued from the crossing, and would not come until the third day, and those days did to Harrowmere what a thaw does to a frozen river. Everything that had been fixed began, quietly and dangerously, to move. The shrouded portrait in the gallery was uncovered. Delphine passed it on the second morning and found herself looking for the first time at the face she had lived beneath for 3 years without ever seeing. Serica had been painted at perhaps 20, dark-eyed, laughing, careless, in the way only the truly beloved can afford to be. Delphine looked at that easy, radiant certainty and understood, with a calm that surprised her, that she had never in her life worn such a face and never would. The staff, who had loved her in their undemonstrative way, now did not know where to put their loyalty, and so they hovered. Old Marin, the housekeeper, who had run Harrowmere for 30 years and buried 2 duchesses' worth of secrets, took to appearing at Delphine's elbow at odd hours with cups of broth and unasked for opinions, her seamed face pinched with a worry she was far too proper to speak. The younger maids whispered and fell silent when she entered. A footman was caught polishing the same length of banister 3 times because he could not stop watching the front doors. And, through all of it, Delphine did what she had always done. She made herself useful and made herself quiet, and used the cover of the general disorder to move unnoticed toward the one room in the house she needed. For if ever there was a season when a duchess might slip through Harrowmere unwatched, it was now, when every eye was fixed on the road from the valley and none on the corridors within. Twice she nearly gave herself away. Once, a young maid found her in the passage outside the estate office. At an hour no duchess had business there, and Delphine had turned the moment aside with an invented errand about linens for the returning lady's rooms, her voice so calm the girl never thought to wonder at it, though Delphine's heart had not steadied for an hour after. And once, worse, old Marin had come upon her studying the muniment room door itself and had said nothing at all, only looked at her for a long moment with those seamed and knowing eyes, and passed on down the corridor with her keys chiming at her waist, and Delphine had understood that, whatever the housekeeper suspected, for reasons of her own, not yet to speak it, the house grew stranger by the hour. Rooms long shut were opened and aired for Serica. The best china was brought up and counted. A hush lay over the servants' hall where there was usually laughter, for no one knew what the lady's return would mean for any of them, and a household that does not know its future walks softly. Delphine moved through it all like a woman crossing a frozen lake, lightly, evenly, listening for the crack, and told herself that in 2 days more it would not matter, because in 2 days more she would be gone down the south road with her father's name in her keeping, and this house behind her forever. The muniment room lay at the cold north end of the house, behind the estate office, behind a second door of oak banded in iron that was kept locked and whose key hung. She had learned this in her first year, and filed it away, and hated herself a little for filing it away, on the ring old Marin carried at her waist. To reach it, Delphine would need the house asleep, the housekeeper's ring, and an hour of certain solitude, and she would have perhaps one chance to take all 3, because after Serica came, the house would never again be this distracted. The night before the lady was expected. That was her one window, and it was closing. She began, therefore, to prepare to note when Marin hung the ring on its hook in a still-room while she scoured the pans, to learn which stair did not creak, to fix in her mind the map of the dark route north. She did it all with her face composed and her hands steady, the model duchess seeing calmly to her household on the eve of her own quiet undoing. She had not reckoned on one thing. She had been so certain that every eye in the house was turned toward the valley road that she had stopped watching the windows. And so she did not know that on the second evening, as she stood in the still room memorizing the precise hook where the great iron ring was hung, a man stood at the dark end of the passage with the estate ledger forgotten in his hand, a man who had come looking for his wife, because he could not for reasons he did not examine. Stop looking for her, and who now watched her study his housekeeper's keys with an attention that had nothing to do with broth or banisters, and felt the first cold threat of a question he had never once thought to ask about the quiet woman he had married. Old Marin found her the next morning in the linen room, and did not pretend to be there by accident.
"Sit, child,"
the housekeeper said, and though Delphine was a duchess and Marin a servant, Delphine sat, because there are authorities older than rank. Marin lowered herself onto the bench beside the folded sheets with the care of a woman whose knees had counted 30 winters in that house. "I have watched you 3 years, Marin said, without preamble. "I watched the last one before you, and the old Duchess before her, and I have learned to tell the difference between a woman who is sad and a woman who is settling accounts. You are the second kind. You have the look my own mother had the week before she left my father, still as deep water and twice as far down." She folded her hands. "You mean to go before that woman comes through the doors." "I mean to be sensible," Delphine said. "Sensible." Marin said the word as though tasting something gone slightly off. There is a great deal of harm done in this world by sensible women who will not make a scene. You have decided to lose him. You have not once thought to ask whether he wishes to be lost. I have kept the secrets of this house for 30 years, the old woman went on, lower now. I kept the old Duke's, and I will not pretend to you, I did not guess there was one worth keeping at the end, for the way he took to sitting alone in that north room in his last months, and the way he looked at nothing. I never asked. It was not my place, and I told myself a servant's loyalty is to keep. Not to question, I have wondered since whether that was loyalty or only cowardice wearing loyalty's coat. Her seamed face was hard to read in the dim linen room. So do not speak to me of being sensible and keeping quiet, and not making a scene. I have been sensible 30 years, and I am not at all certain, looking back, that I did right by it. Delphine's calm held, but only just. He grieved her 5 years. Marin, that is not a thing a wife may argue with. No, the old woman's voice gentled. But grief is what love turns into when it has nowhere else to go. It does not follow that love comes back the same shape when the reason for the grief walks in out of the cold. You reason it out, like a sum. She was first, therefore she is owed. But a debt is not a heart. Child, a man may owe one woman and want another, and the tragedy of a decent man is that he will try to pay the debt and call it honor. She reached out and astonishingly took Delphine's chapped, careful hand in her own. You are not what you pretend to be here. I knew it the first month. Those are not a settlement bride's hands, and that is not a settlement bride's stillness. You carry something. I have never asked what. I only tell you this, whatever you came here to do, and I think you came here to do something, you will not do it by folding yourself into a box and vanishing before the trouble starts. The brave thing and the quiet thing are not always the same thing. She rose, her knees protesting, and paused at the door. When you are ready to stop being sensible, she said. The ring hangs on the 3rd hook in the still room, and I am a heavy sleeper, and I do not always count my keys of a morning. Make of that what you will. Delphine sat a long while after the door had closed. The linen room was warm and smelled of lavender and clean-pressed cotton, the most ordinary comfort in the world, and she found her eyes stinging in a way they had not for years. It was not the cruelty of this house that had ever threatened to break her. She had been armored against cruelty since she was 16. It was kindness she had no defense for. The old woman's rough hand around her own, the offered key, the plain refusal to let her vanish quietly. She had built her whole survival on being owed nothing and needing no one, and Marin had reached straight through that with a cup of broth and a handful of keys, and undone more of it in 10 minutes than Rowan's silences had undone in 3 years. And she was gone, leaving Delphine sitting very still among the linens, understanding that the one person in Harrowmere who had seen through her entirely had just, without once naming it, handed her the key. She went that night, the last night before Serica was due, her single window before the house filled with strangers and the muniment room passed forever beyond her reach. The house had gone to sleep uneasy, the way a house does on the eve of a thing it cannot stop. Delphine waited until the last stair had ceased to creak and the last line of candlelight had died beneath the servants' doors, and then she rose in her dark wrapper, took her single unlit candle, and went down through the cold body of the house toward the still room. The iron ring hung on the third hook, exactly where Marin had said, and it did not so much as chime as she lifted it free. She had wrapped the keys in a strip of flannel against just that sound. She had planned this, in one form or another, for 3 years. The muniment room's iron-banded door gave to the third key she tried. With a groan she felt in her teeth. Inside, the air was dead and dry, and smelled of dust and old wax and the particular mineral coldness of a room without a fire. She struck her light. The flame steadied and showed her walls of pigeonholes and deed boxes and ledgers stacked to the ceiling, 40 years of a great family's paper, and somewhere in it, if she was right, the one sheet that would give her father back his name. She knew what she was looking for. The old Duke had been a hoarder, but a methodical one. The mineral ventures would be filed by year, and the year of her father's ruin she knew as she knew her own birthday. She set the candle in a sconce and began to work along the boxes, her cold fingers walking the labeled spines, and the great injustice of a decade seemed to narrow, at last to the width of a single drawer. Her hands knew the work. She had rehearsed it 1,000 times in the dark behind her eyes, deed boxes for the tenant farms, black with age, a run of ledgers bound in calf, the estate accounts of 40 years, bundles of letters tied in faded tape. She read the labels by the wavering light, her lips moving, and told herself to be methodical, to be her father's daughter, to let no shaking of the hand hurry her past the very thing she had come for. Somewhere below a clock struck the half-hour, and the small sound went through her like cold water, and she made herself breathe and read on. And then her fingers stilled on a japanned case at the far end, black and cold, its label in the old Duke's crabbed hand, giving the very year, the year her father's name had died. She had found it. After 3 years of waiting and a lifetime of belief, it was here, an arm's length away, and her whole body went strange and light, and it was in that exact moment, with her hand outstretched and her heart in her throat, that the voice came out of the dark behind her. She did not hear the door. "There is no coal survey in that box," said Rowan's voice, quiet and level in the dark behind her. "My father kept the mineral papers in the black japanned cases along the far wall. You are among the marriage settlements." Delphine did not scream. She did not spin round. She had, she found, been half expecting this her whole life, the voice out of the dark, the moment the pretense ended. And so, when it came, she only closed her eyes once, and opened them, and turned. He stood inside the door, with his own candle still dressed, having plainly not gone to bed at all. His face gave away nothing, but he had said, "coal survey." He had said mineral papers. He had named the exact thing she sought before she had touched it, which meant he had not stumbled on a thieving wife by accident. He had been waiting to see what she would reach for. "How long have you known," she said, her voice held, "that you married me for something in this room?" He set his candle down. "I did not know it until 3 nights ago, when I watched you memorize where Marin hangs her keys. I have spent the days since going through my father's papers myself, trying to understand what a woman would risk her name and her marriage to steal from a dead man." His eyes did not leave her. "I did not find theft. I found your name, not Delphine Aldermere, the other one, the one you were born with." A pause that lasted a small eternity. Vain. "For years," he went on, "and there was no accusation in it now, only a kind of wonder that was harder to bear than accusation would have been. 3 years you have sat across my table and walked my galleries and slept beneath my roof, carrying this. I have prided myself all my life on being a man no one could deceive. I read a ledger, and I know at a glance where the figures have been made to lie. And a slight, quiet woman in a gray gown deceived me daily for 3 years, and I never once suspected, because I never once troubled to look. That is not to your discredit, Delphine. It is entirely to mine. The room tilted. She put her hand on the cold edge of a deed box to steady it. Then you know what my father was called, she said. I know what he was called. Something had come into his voice that she had never heard there. Not anger, not quite. A terrible carefulness. A fraud. A man who ruined a dozen honest investors with a lying map. The great scandal of the year I turned 19. He took a single step toward her across the dead cold room. What I do not yet know, and what I find I must know before I can draw another easy breath under my own roof, is why the daughter of that man married the son of the house that assembled those investors, and came here, and smiled at me across my own table for 3 years. For the sake of a box of coal surveys she now tells me with her whole body she believes will prove him innocent. Delphine looked at him for a long moment. And she understood that the hour she had dreaded and half longed for had arrived, and that there was no version of the next words that let her keep both her secret and her dignity. And so she chose the dignity. "Because I believe your father made him a liar," she said clearly, without a tremor. "I believe the survey my father certified was honest, and that a page of it was swapped in this house before it was ever bound into the copy that reached the courts, and that the truth of it has sat locked in this room for 11 years while his name rotted. I did not marry you for coal, Your Grace. I married you for the one honest map in England, and it is in one of those black cases on the far wall, and I have waited 3 years to reach it, and I would have reached it tonight and been gone before your ghost ever touched the gates." She lifted her chin. "Now you know everything. You may call it what you like, but I will look at that survey before you throw me out of this house." He did not throw her out. He did not speak at all for the space of several heartbeats. Then Rowan turned, crossed to the far wall, drew down the black japanned case with his own hands, and set it on the table between them. "Then we will look at it together," he said, and there it was. The whole of it turned in an instant. She had come into this room braced for accusation, for the magistrate, for the cold ducal voice pronouncing her a thief and her marriage a fraud. She had not once, in 3 years of imagining this moment, allowed herself to picture the man simply crossing the room and setting the evidence of his own family's crime on the table before her, on her side, as though there had never been any question which side he would take. It undid her more thoroughly than anger could have. Anger she knew how to meet. This she had no armor for at all. The case was locked, and the small key was not on Marin's ring. Rowan looked at it a moment, then took up the iron poker from the cold grate, and with a single controlled blow, broke the hasp. It was the least controlled thing Delphine had ever seen him do, and he did it, she understood, so that she would not have to be the one who broke into his father's papers, so that whatever they found, the trespass would be his and not hers. Inside were the mineral ventures of a decade, filed as he had said by year. He found the year without needing to ask her which it was, and that small fact, that he had listened in the dark days between, closely enough to know, undid something in her chest that 3 years of silence had not. He drew out the bound court copy of the survey, the very document that had been laid before the magistrates 11 years before, its stitching still tight, and opened it on the table under both their candles. It was a map of a coal seam, annotated in a fine sloping hand, and across the bottom of the first page ran a surveyor's certification and a signature. "Casimir Vane. That is his hand," Delphine whispered. "That is his true hand. I would know it among 1,000. But Rowan was not looking at the signature. He was looking at the third leaf, where the seam was measured and the yields estimated, and at the paper itself held close to the flame. "This sheet," he said slowly, "is not the same stock as the others. The watermark is wrong. The rest of this copy is Haromir's own laid paper. My father bought it by the ream for 40 years. This one leaf is not." He ran his thumb along the inner margin where the binding thread passed. "And look, the stitching here has been cut and reset. The original third leaf was unpicked from the binding, and a false one sewn in its place. It was done badly in a hurry by someone who never dreamed the bound copy would one day be unstitched and read against what it replaced." He looked up at her, and his stone face had gone white. "You were right. Your father told the truth. And it was done in this house." "Then, where is the honest leaf they cut out?" she said. He was already searching, through the case, through the box, his long hands suddenly urgent, and it was Delphine reaching past him into the empty japanned case whose fingers found the false bottom, and beneath it not one sheet but two. A single loose leaf of survey paper in her father's sloping hand, its cut edge matching exactly the gap in the bound copy, and folded around it, a letter of Haromir laid paper, sealed and never sent, addressed in the old Duke's own hand to a magistrate 11 years dead. She lifted the loose leaf first and laid it against the binding, and the cut edges met like two halves of a broken thing made whole. The honest measurements, the true yields, the map her father had sworn to with his life. For a moment neither of them spoke. The two candles guttered in the dead cold air of the room, and the thing they had both spent days circling toward lay plain on the table between them at last. The honest map and the false one, side by side, the truth and the lie made visible in the same lamplight. Delphine put out one finger and touched the true leaf. Her father's true leaf, the ink he had laid down with his own hand a dozen years before he was called a liar for it, and she found she could not speak at all. Rowan looked from the reunited pages to her face, and whatever he saw, there seemed to cost him something. He had come into this room, she understood, half prepared to find a scheming woman who had used his grief and his name, and he had found instead a daughter kneeling at the grave of her father's honor. And the distance between what he had expected and what stood before him had plainly knocked the breath from a man who prided himself on being surprised by nothing. She did not open the letter. She could not. She held it out to Rowan with both hands, and her whole composed and careful life narrowed to the trembling of that one sheet in the candlelight, and from somewhere below them in the sleeping house came the long, low sound of Bramble beginning to bark, and then, strangely, the bark softened and died. The way the old dog only ever quieted for someone the house had once known, and beneath it came the rattle of a carriage on the valley road, closer than it had any right to be at such an hour. Serica had come a night early and in the dark, and the truth was in Delphine's hands, unopened, and the choice she had run from was about to walk through the doors. Rowan broke the seal. He read it once, in silence, his face lit from below by the guttering candle. And then he read it again more slowly, and Delphine watched the years rearrange themselves behind his eyes. When at last he spoke, his voice was not quite his own. "It is a confession," he said, "of a kind. My father writes to the magistrate that the venture was failing, that he stood to lose a great fortune and his name with it, and that he had a man cut the honest leaf from the survey and sew a false one in its place, the map made to certify the seam rich when your father had certified it worthless." He turned the letter toward the flame as though the ink might yet say something kinder. "He writes that he chose your father's certification to carry the lie because your father was the most respected surveyor in England, and no one would doubt his name. He writes that he watched the trial and said nothing, and he writes, here, at the end where the hand shakes, that he means at last to confess it and make it right." Rowan's own hand was not steady now. "It is dated a fortnight before he died. He never sent it. He died with your father's ruin on his conscience, and this letter under a false bottom, and he let a good man go into the ground a liar, rather than face what he himself had done. He read her portions of it aloud, his level voice faltering, where the old Dukes had faltered, and each sentence fell into the cold room like a stone into a well. The failing venture, the panic of a proud man watching his fortune and his name go down together. The clerk summoned in the small hours, the binding unpicked, the true page burned. No, he read, not burned. The true page kept, heaven knew why. Perhaps because even a guilty man cannot quite destroy the proof of another man's innocence, and hidden, with the confession, beneath a false bottom against a day of reckoning that the old Duke had meant to bring, and had died a fortnight too soon to bring. He set the letter down as though it burned him to hold. Delphine watched him and understood that she was witnessing something few living souls had ever seen, the Duke of Harrowmere with his composure entirely gone. The county would not have known him. The tenants who called him cold, the footmen who could not say how he took his tea, none of them would have recognized this man standing white and unstrung in the guttering light of a dead room, holding his own father's guilt in his two hands. And she found to her own confusion that she did not want to be avenged upon him. She wanted, absurdly, to cross the room and take the letter out of his hands so that he would not have to hold it. "My father did this," he said, and the words came slowly, each one paid for. "And I have lived 11 years believing this house honorable. I have sat in judgment on tenants for the theft of a snared rabbit, while the great theft of my family's whole history lay locked in a case 40 feet from my chair. And for 3 years, Delphine, I believed you a poor, grateful girl I had been generous enough to save. I let myself feel, heaven help me, a little noble about it." His voice thinned, "when all the while you were the one wronged, and I was the unwitting heir of the man who wronged you. You slept under the roof of the house that destroyed your father. You were gracious to me every single day of it. You warmed these rooms, and gentled my servants, and taught a cold man to sit closer to his own table. And you knew the whole time what my blood had done to yours, and you never once let it turn you cruel." He stopped, and something in the great disciplined structure of him gave way all at once, quietly, the way a beam long-rotted gives without a sound until the moment it goes. She had never seen a proud man break before, not truly, not down to the foundations. Her father's breaking had been done out of her sight, in courtrooms and behind closed doors, and had come to her only as its aftermath. This she saw whole, the straightening spine, the careful voice, the whole architecture of a man who had spent 5 years holding himself upright by discipline alone, all of it coming quietly down in the guttering light of a room full of his family's paper. And she understood that he was not weeping for his father, nor even, quite, for her. He was weeping for 11 years of a story he had believed about himself and his house that had turned out, in a single night, to be a lie sewn into a binding. "Why," he said, "why were you not cruel? You had every right. You had cause to hate this house and every stone in it, and me most of all. Instead, you put a blanket on my knees. Tell me why." "Because I stopped wanting the proof more than I wanted the mornings," Delphine said, very quietly. "That is my whole confession, Rowan, and it shames me more than the spying ever did. I came for a map. I told myself for a year that everything I did here, the mirrors, the wine, the second place at the table, was only the spy's craft, only a way to be trusted and left alone near the room I needed. And then one winter, it stopped being craft. I banked your fire and looked at your face with the grief gone out of it, and I wanted more than I have ever wanted my father's name back, only to be allowed to stand in a warm room beside you for the rest of an ordinary life." Her eyes were wet now, though her voice did not break. She had wept too many years in silence for it to break easily. And that was the trap of it, because I knew that if I ever showed you this letter, you would look back over 3 years and wonder whether every kind thing I ever did was only the spy at her work. You would never be able to tell my love from my strategy, and neither some nights could I. So I decided to spare us both. To take my father's honest name and go, and leave you your ghost, and never make you weigh a debt you owed my family, against a woman you had every reason to choose instead. I did not want to be chosen out of guilt. I have been owed things my whole life, Rowan. Apologies, pity, restitution that never came. I could not bear to add you to the list of things the world owed me and would not pay. Below them, the great doors of Harrowmere groaned open. There were voices in the hall, a woman's warm and travel-worn, Marin's sharp with the fright of an unlooked-for midnight arrival, and beneath it all Bramble, who had gone from barking to a low and certain whine, caught between an old scent he half remembered and the two people he loved standing frozen in the cold north room. Rowan looked at the letter in his hand and at the honest leaf lying whole against its binding, and at his wife's wet and steady face, and Delphine saw the exact moment the man of 5 years' discipline set the discipline down, deliberately, the way another man might lay down a sword he had carried so long he had forgotten its weight. You have made a great many decisions for me tonight, he said. In the belief that you were sparing me, you have decided what I feel, and whom I owe, and what I would choose, and you have packed a trunk on the strength of it. You will not decide this one alone. And he took her cold hand in his, the letter folded between their two palms, and led her out of the muniment room and down the great stair, toward the light and the voices, toward the woman waiting in the hall, so that whatever was to be chosen would be chosen in the open, and by both of them, and not quietly, and not alone. Serica stood in the light of the hall lamps, and she was not a ghost. She was a handsome woman near 40, weathered by 5 years of a life no one at Harrowmere had imagined for her, and the first thing she did when Rowan came down the stair was to look at his hand closed around Delphine's, and something in her fine, tired face settled, as though a question she had carried across a continent had answered itself before she could ask it. So, Serica said, I am too late, and I find I am glad of it. She said it plainly, and Delphine understood at once that whatever the county's ballads had made of this woman, she was not one who trafficked in false grief. I did not cross the sea to reclaim you, Rowan. I came because you deserved to hear from my own mouth that I lived, rather than a rumor carried third hand. And because there was a debt of truth between us, I would not leave unpaid across the water. 5 years is a long time. I am not the girl in that portrait, and I have not been for a great while, and I think, looking at the two of you standing there, that you stopped needing her some time ago, and only never let yourself know it. Her dark eyes moved to Delphine, frank and without hostility. The house has found a better mistress than the careless girl I was. I am not sorry to have stopped being her. She told them, over the cold, small hours in the hall, and the days that followed the shape of the years that had swallowed her. The ship had not gone down whole. A handful had reached the African shore in a boat, and Serica among them, and what followed had been captivity and ransom, and a long, slow passage back through a dozen ports under a dozen borrowed names, years in which she had been by turns a prisoner, a governess, a merchant's bookkeeper, and at last a free woman with a small business of her own in a warm foreign city. She had come, against all expectation, to love. I wrote, she said, twice in the early years when I dared hope a letter might get through. I do not know if they ever reached this house. I had half decided they had not, and that I was as good as dead here, and that it was kinder to let the dead lie. They did not reach me, Rowan said quietly, and something passed over his face. The thought perhaps of letters gone astray, of years of grief that might have been shorter, of the strange machinery of chance that had made him a widower in his own mind, and then, 5 years on, unmated in a single night. I am glad you are alive, Serica. I find I can say that now with my whole heart and no other thing tangled in it. and I am gladder still that you came home in time to see me be less of a fool than I have been for a very long while." It might have ended there, in relief, in the awkward grace of three decent people discovering there was no war to fight. But Rowan lifted the folded letter and told them both, in his trimmed and level way, what it was, and whose hand had written it, and whose name it cleared, and the hall went very still. And here was the moment Delphine had never once let herself imagine, because she had never dared believe she would be standing in the light to see it, the moment of justice, and what a person would do with it once it was finally wholly in her hands. For there was a living man to answer for the cut and re-sewn leaf, the steward's clerk of 11 years ago, now the steward himself, grown gray and comfortable in Harrowmere's service, who had been the old Duke's instrument in the muniment room, and who was even now roused from his bed and standing white-faced at the edge of the hall. Having heard his own crime read aloud into the night, vengeance was there for the taking. Delphine could have had him broken as her father was broken, turned out, disgraced, handed to the magistrate, his name made a byword as Vane's had been made a byword. It would have been fair. Fairness, old Marin had said in the linen room, is giving people what they deserve. But Delphine looked at the shaking old man and thought of her father, who had gone to his grave asking only to be believed, and never once to be avenged, and she found she wanted no more ruin in the world, only the ending of the ruin already made. "I do not want him destroyed," she said to Rowan, to the hall, to the 11 silent ears. "I want it written true. I want this survey and this letter laid before the same court that condemned my father, and his name struck clean, and printed where his name was blackened, so that the last word said of Casimir Vane in this country is that he was honest. That is all I have ever wanted. The man may keep his life." She turned to the clerk. "You will testify to what you did, and sign what your master could not bring himself to send. Do that, and you may live out your days quietly and unpunished, which is a great deal more than you allowed my father. Refuse, and I will show you exactly how fair I am able to be." She turned away from him. "That is justice. The other thing, the breaking of him, is only grief wearing justice's coat. And I have worn enough grief for one life." The old clerk lifted his head. Whatever he had feared coming down that stair in his nightshirt, the magistrate, ruin, the rope, it had not been mercy. And mercy, it seemed, was harder to bear than any of them. His face crumpled. "I have carried it 11 years, he said, so quietly they had to lean to hear him. "He told me it was only figures, only a page. I have said that to myself 10,000 nights and never once believed it." He looked at Delphine with the wet, ruined eyes of an old man who has met too late, the one person he most wronged and never knew. "I will sign," he said. "I will sign anything you put before me. I should have signed it years ago and gone to the gallows, glad." "You will not go to the gallows," Delphine said. "You will go on living, and every morning you will know my father died, honest, and you helped make him seem otherwise, and you will do what small good you can with the years you have left. That is not the gallows. It is heavier than the gallows. I know, because I have carried the lighter half of it my whole life." She turned from him then, and did not look at him again, and the matter was, so far as she was concerned, closed forever. Rowan looked at her then with something well past admiration and deep into awe, and said low, so that the whole roused house might hear it and carry it out through Harrowmere by morning, "Then let the county learn her true name. Not the poor bride I was said to have saved. Lady Delphine Vane, daughter of an honest man, who came into the house that wronged her father and repaid it with 3 years of mercy." He said it as an honor plainly, before them all, and it was the first time in 11 years that the name Vane had been spoken under any roof in that country as anything but a curse, and the house heard it. By the next morning it had gone out through Harrowmere the way such things always go, from the hall to the kitchens to the stables to the farthest tenant cottage on the high moor, that the quiet Duchess was no poor bride the Duke had stooped to save, but a wronged gentleman's daughter who had come into the house that ruined her father and, given at last the power to break the man who did it, had chosen instead to have the truth written plain and let the guilty live. It was not the kind of story the county was used to telling about the great house. It was a better one, and they knew it, and they'd told it for years. Spring came late to the high moor that year, and then all at once the muniment room stood open now, aired and swept, its false bottoms all turned out into the light. The court in the county town had sat in the raw end of winter. The honest leaf had been laid against the doctored binding before the same bench that had condemned him. The old Duke's unsent confession read into the record. And the name of Casimir Vane, struck clean and printed vindicated in the very papers that had once printed his ruin, so that the last generation to read of Vane read of a wronged and honest man. The Grey Steward had signed and testified, and been let quietly go to a small living, far away, alive and unpunished, but for the knowledge of what he had cost, which Delphine judged punishment enough, and had, in truth, ceased to think about it all. Delphine had gone to the county town herself for the hearing, in a plain dark traveling gown, and had sat very straight at the front of the room, while the honest leaf and the doctored binding were laid before the bench and the old Duke's confession was read aloud into the record. She had thought she would weep. She did not. She sat dry-eyed and composed, her hands folded, and listened to a stranger. In a wig undue in the space of a single gray afternoon, the lie that had shaped her entire adult life. It was Rowan, beside her, unaccustomed to being moved in public and plainly hating it, who had turned his face to the window when the magistrate at last pronounced the name of Casimir Vane cleared of all charge and his reputation restored in full. Afterward, in the inn where they waited for the horses, he had said the only thing that had made her weep in the whole affair. He would have been glad, I think, Rowan had said, to know his daughter was the one who stood up in that room for him. And Delphine, who had held herself upright through the trial and the ruin and 3 years of a stranger's house, had put her face in her hands at last, and cried as she had not let herself cry since she was 16. And Rowan had not tried to stop her or to speak, but had only sat beside her, close, the way he had learned to sit at the near end of a long table, and let her grief have the room it had waited a decade to fill. Serica had stayed a week. It had surprised everyone, and Delphine most of all, that the two of them became friends, that the woman from the portrait, over long walks in the melting gardens, proved to be dry and brave and entirely without spite, full of stories of the life she had built abroad in the years she was thought drowned. She had sat with Delphine in the library on her last evening, the two of them, and the old dog and the fire, and had said only, at the end of it, he was always going to love the one who stayed. I only ever knew how to leave. Then she had gone on to the life that was truly hers, and left behind her the uncovered portrait of a laughing girl that needed no black cloth any longer, because it no longer meant a wound to anyone who passed it. They walked out most afternoons of that week, the three of them, along the path that ran above the melting garden to the little lake at the foot of the park, with bramble ranging ahead through the last of the snow. It should have been strange, the Duke, his wife, and the woman he had once meant to marry, walking together in the spring light, and perhaps to the servants who watched from the windows, it was the strangest thing Harrowmere had offered them in a generation. But it was not strange to the three who walked it. Serica had a way of naming the awkward thing and laughing it into harmlessness, and by the third day the years of ghost and grief and secret had thinned to something they could all speak of plainly, even lightly, the way survivors of the same long winter speak of the cold once the thaw has come. Delphine had not left. The plain leather trunk had been carried back up to the box room and stood empty there now, gathering dust in a far corner, a thing she passed sometimes, and looked at the way one looks at a coat one very nearly drowned in, with a small private shiver and a deeper gratitude. She was in the library on the first truly warm evening of the year, in the deep chair by the cold hearth, when Rowan came in with the last gold of the day behind him. They had not spoken of the great things since the winter. They had done instead what they had always done, move gently around each other in the shared country of their evenings, learning the new and easier shape of a marriage that was no longer built over a locked room. But he did not go to the desk tonight. He came and stood before her chair, and Bramble stretched between them on the rug as he had been stretched 1,000 nights, thumped his tail once and did not trouble to rise, being wiser than either of them about what was already settled. "I have been a methodical man my whole life," Rowan said. "I have made every decision of this estate by weighing it slowly and weighing it twice, and I have prided myself on never once being hasty. And I find that this same caution has made me the slowest kind of fool about the one thing that needed no weighing at all, because I was afraid that if I said it aloud, you would hear guilt in it, or debt, and you have told me plainly enough and more than once what you think of being owed." He stopped. For once in his careful, trimmed life, the sentences deserted him entirely, and he was only a man standing in the fading light with nothing left to hide behind. So I will say it with no ledger and no reckoning behind it. I do not owe you this. I want it. I have wanted it. Since long before I had any right to. Since the winter, you set a blanket over my knees and let me keep the small dignity of pretending some servant had done it. Stay. Not because my house wronged yours and this is the mending of it. Not because it is just or fair or owed. Stay because the mornings are better when you are in them, and because I have been an even greater fool than my father, for he only buried one honest thing in that room, and I very nearly let 2 of them walk out of my own front door inside a leather trunk. Delphine rose from the chair. She did not feign surprise, and she did not look away, and she did not, this once, reach for the stillness that had armored her whole life. She let him see her whole unguarded face, the way she had only ever let a sleeping man see it. "I stopped packing weeks ago, Rowan," she said. "The trunk has stood empty in the box room since the winter. I was only waiting to hear you ask me to unpack it for the right reason. And is this the right reason?" "It is the only one I would ever have stayed for." For a moment they only stood, the width of the old hearthrug and 3 years of careful silence between them, and neither seemed to know how to cross it now that there was nothing left in the way. It was, of all things, the most ordinary difficulty in the world, 2 people who had at last said the true thing and did not quite know what came after, and Delphine, who had faced down a housekeeper's cruelty, and a duke in the dark, and a courtroom full of strangers without flinching, found her courage failing her here, at the one threshold that had never had any danger in it at all. He did not sweep her up, it was not his way, and she loved that it was not. He took both her hands instead, the chapped, careful scholar's hands he had once mistaken for a poor bride's, and held them between his own. And Bramble rose at last from the warm hollow of the rug and crossed the little distance and pressed his great gray head against their joined hands. As though to set his seal on the whole long business, the old dog who had watched a wife fold her life into a box and had lain grieving across the door of it, and who now leaned his full warm weight against the 2 people who had, at the last and in the open, and by their own difficult choosing, decided to stay. Outside the tall windows, the last light was going gold across the moor, the same bleak country that had looked, 6 months before, like the end of the world, and looked now only like home. Somewhere below in the warming house a maid was singing over her work, a thing that had not been heard at Harrowmere in living memory, and the sound came up faint through the floors, unremarkable and ordinary and worth, Delphine thought, more than the whole contents of the muniment room put together. She stood a moment longer with her hands in his and listened to it, the small, bright thread of a servant girl singing in a house that had forgotten how, the surest sign she knew that the long winter of the place was truly over, and thought that of all the things she had come to Harrowmere to find, this was the one she had never once thought to look for. And the one she would have grieved the longest to leave behind. And the silence of Harrowmere, which had been for so long the silence of grief, and then the harder silence of a secret kept in a locked northern room, became at last the third and best kind of silence, the deep, unhurried quiet of a house with nothing left to hide, warming slowly from the inside outward towards some,